So this is actually very interesting because then with cycle design, your test plus Anadrol or test plus Winstrol or test plus Trenbolone would make more sense than test plus a DHT derivative.
It does. If you're looking for an end result that's greater than just milligrams.
Okay, so let's review the tier list. In S tier, we have testosterone and Dienolone, and maybe Trenbolone. But if Dienolone is better, according to Kurt, or according to Dean, then we'll have to move Trenbolone to A tier, alongside Primobolan and Winstrol. B tier, nothing. C tier, Equipoise and Masteron. D tier, Nandrolone. E tier, Tristolone. And F tier, the trash tier, Dihydroboldenone.
Yep, I like it.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. Next time we'll do the oral steroids, and then after that we'll do the niche stuff, because this is about 12 oral steroids, and then there's a couple niche drugs. This was very insightful. I'm looking forward to use Dienolone because testosterone, Primobolan, Winstrol, and even Trenbolone is something I wouldn't go without, even though I can't wait to get off the Trenbolone. Maybe Dienolone is a suitable replacement. Dean, hook me up.
Something out.
Okay, so let's discuss this classification of the anabolic steroids, because you can basically classify them in genomic and non-genomic responses. Which is a very easy classification. I never thought about it in that sense, but please fill us in because it sounds intriguing and actually very informative.
Yeah, so we we break it into two classes, class 1 and class 2. And the initial part, so class 1 is going to be things that work through the classic androgen receptor. Right? So you have, to explain this a little further so people understand, you really have 3 known locations on the cell for the androgen receptor. There's the classic one that goes to the cell surface, binds an androgen, brings it in and causes protein synthesis. That's the majority of what we're looking for from an androgen. You have the one that stays on the cell surface that does not cause gene transcription. That's typically what's considered non-genomic. I can go into what those effects are as well. And then you have one that's subcellular that we know very little about. And the only practical drug that we use that interacts with that is Winstrol. Danazol also interacts with that, but no one in the right mind is using Danazol.
Okay.
So we're not really sure that's kind of what makes Winstrol unique, is that it seems to be the only one that deals with that. So in the simplest terms, a class 1 drug that interacts with the androgen receptor is just dealing with protein expression, right? And that's where the genetic thing in bodybuilding comes from. Your response to steroids is genetically controlled, right? That's what bodybuilding is. It's your genetic response to drugs, training, and food. The non-genomic, so we don't really know all of the non-genomic responses to drugs. The 3 that I'm pretty well aware of are nerve stimulation, which you see with things like halotestin, Anadrol. That's immediate strength, right? That you get in a day or 2 from taking these things, or if you take pre-workout.
Right.
And then there is, so whatever's occurring in the microsome with this stanozol, with the Winstrol, that is non-genomic as well. But again, we don't know what that response is. And technically, the proliferation of stem cells would be considered non-genomic as well. So that's kind of interesting. So most steroids have mixed activity, but most of them favor one or the other. Like testosterone is fully mixed, right?
Right.
It is the original hormone, and it is fully mixed activity. And then what we did is we classified them based on how they respond. And the practical use of this stuff, it's not just arbitrary, is then how and why you would combine certain things to get an effect, right? So the typical class 1 drugs would be, testosterone being mixed, EQ, Primobolan, Anavar, Trenbolone. So Trenbolone is Nandrolone, pretty much are all class 1 drugs. Some of the drugs we don't really know what they're fully doing, like Masteron, right? We don't know.
Yeah, it hasn't been studied.
Check drops, who knows? And then class 2, what would Dianabol, Anadrol, which has no known affinity for the androgen receptor, Winstrol, and Anadrol, Dianabol, and Winstrol would be the classic type 2 drugs. So then when you're combining things, if you start with testosterone as a base, right, and you add another compound to it, if you add EQ, like we discussed before, you're really just adding milligrams. You're getting a 1 plus 2, a 1 plus 1 equals
all
2.
The same pathway. Yeah, it's all the same pathway.
You're just hitting the AR over and over again. So you're not getting anything more out of EQ from a pure muscle building point of view than you would by just raising the testosterone in theory. In fact, you're probably getting less. But when you combine the classes, you get a synergistic effect. So you would technically cover all the bases by adding, testosterone again as a base, trenbolone and anadrol, or trenbolone and dianabol, or the addition of winstrol would technically cover all of the bases, and you'd have a much more magnified effect. So anyone who's ever used trenbolone and anadrol together, it's much more noticeable growth than you would get just from adding primo and tren.
All right.
If that makes sense. So that's really the simplest way to explain it. So it explains why you would choose to add certain things depending on the effect you're looking for versus just adding milligrams, right? And there are effects to some of these other class 1, like EQ, right, with the vascularity and things, or Mastron with the hardening. But again, you're not getting a greater sum than you would by just raising testosterone. So really the effective, unique drugs. That doesn't mean that there's not a purpose of all the other drugs, but the ones that are really unique are test, tren, winstrol, anadrol, and dianabol all do something very unique inside the body, versus the other ones, really, there's just a lot of, overshadowing in their effects. There's not a ton of stuff that comes out of primo that you couldn't get from test, or nandrolone that you couldn't get from test. Right. So this is kind of when we look at what's effective and what's not.
So when it comes to stacking, ages ago, I made a video about anabolic pathways. We have the androgen receptor, right? We have glucocorticoid receptor inhibition, growth hormone receptor, maybe some anabolism through the beta-2 adrenergic receptors, insulin receptor, IGF-1 receptor, etc. But maybe we can specify or split up this androgen receptor into 3 pathways. And then with intelligent compound selection, right, like you said, testosterone, trenbolone, winstrol, anadrol, dianabol, in certain contexts, you get more mileage out of these 3 subtypes of the androgen receptor, whether that's genomic, non-genomic, or within the cytoplasm, what you said.
Yeah.
So you get 3 anabolic pathways out of 1 classification of anabolics, right? And of course, growth hormone could be considered an anabolic alongside testosterone base or other anabolic steroids. And clenbuterol salbutamol can be classified as an anabolic through the beta-2 adrenergic receptor. So this is actually very interesting, because then with cycle design, your test plus anadrol or test plus winstrol or test plus trenbolone would make more sense than test plus a DHT derivative.
It does. If you're looking for an end result that's greater than just milligrams, right? But again, if you're a new user and you don't necessarily need that strong effect, maybe that's not the smartest way to go, right? Because there are side effects with anadrol, trenbolone, and those, winstrol, like we said, is a fantastic drug, but there are side effects that there's a risk there.
So on the fly, can you design like a cookie cutter protocol that would optimize all these pathways just off the fly?
Yeah. So if you just did test, tren, anadrol, and winstrol, like if you used, a smaller dose of anadrol and a smaller dose of winstrol in there together, that would cover all of the bases. There would be really nothing left that you wouldn't, that you could accomplish with adding something else.
So all I'm missing is the anadrol.
Yeah, or you could just use, right, so 50 milligrams of anadrol plus 50 milligrams of tren, as an example, is going to be more effective than 100 milligrams of either of them by themselves.
Right.
So that's really just the theory versus, adding 50 milligrams of Mastron to 50 milligrams of primo doesn't do anything to yield you 100 milligrams of androgens.
Yeah,
because you see a lot of just arbitrary cycle designs where guys just throw in compounds. Again, you're increasing the milligrams, so you should be increasing the effect to a certain degree, but is it even more effective than just raising the dose of the test? Probably not.
No, probably not. So this is true synergy, where you're optimizing all of these pathways. And this is always my cycle design philosophy has been like you get the maximum amount of anabolism through each pathway with the minimal side effects. And this is why I keep dosages low, but the compound selection is wide.
Yes, you get more of an effect with
more of an effect on lower dosages, and of course the overall exposure. Right, I'm still exposing myself to 750 milligrams of steroids per week. Whoop-de-fucking-do. It's not the end of the world. But I'm also, on Increlex 2 times a week, the IGF-1 and the growth hormone, which increases my IGF-1 levels. And then I was using a beta-2 and beta-3 adrenergic receptor agonist, which can have some overlap for anabolism. Right, so I got all my anabolic pathways covered, but it's good to know that combining particular steroids can actually enhance this pathway through the androgen receptor more. Has this been studied in selective androgen receptor modulators, or have you not really dived into that?
No, they have not. So that's kind of thing where science then always falls behind, right? Because there's not a lot of polypharmacy being used. The closest thing is in HIV. Sometimes there'll be multiple chemicals used, but again, you're talking about HIV. So the outcome is, the muscle gain is not going to be the same as in you and I. No. But you can even see it in the golden era bodybuilders. They were doing it by default, right? So the classic cycle most of these guys are running was Deca, Primo, and D-ball, right? So D-ball was magnifying the androgen receptor activity of the Primo and the nandrolone.
Yeah.
Right? They didn't even, and it was giving some level of estrogen too. They didn't even know what they were doing. It was what was available, and it worked.
With the scientific evidence showing that androgen receptor expression is upregulated in the presence of androgens, is that results that in more genomic or non-genomic responses, or both?
Probably both to some degree, but mostly we know what the genomic response. So during the translation stage, so originally it was thought that when an androgen receptor was bound, that it would cause another androgen receptor, but that's not an efficient process. So what's actually happening is when the androgen receptor goes into the nucleus, and during the translation stage of protein synthesis, a new androgen receptor is formed because it's part of that new DNA. So it's during that process. So where you could limit that, if you're not eating enough food, that translation stage is the only stage in protein synthesis that your body's looking for some level of calories, right? It needs energy. Now, it's not great. And this is also where guys go wrong. They're eating too much food. You don't need to eat a massive amount of food over maintenance to allow this to occur. But if you're in a deficit during translation, who's to say that there will be more androgen receptors created? Right? Because you're probably slowing protein synthesis down. Trembolone could perhaps outwork that, but none of the other drugs are really going to do that.
All right, so trembolone is part of every cutting stack, what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty much. So that's probably another reason to use it.
But
you could be any of those things. It could be Anadrol with right? Again, test as a basic. It could be Anadrol with EQ or Anadrol. Again, they're probably not as effective as with trembolone, because now you're talking about KD values. You're talking about the constant of the strength of a drug. The strength of trembolone is significantly stronger. It has a lower KD value, which means it's stronger than EQ, for instance, right? Trestolone would be another good example. Trestolone would be significantly stronger on a milligram basis than Primabol.
Now, from what I do understand from all the research that I've done, like the genomic versus non-genomic responses have been poorly documented. So maybe with more time, probably not, because it seems that the medical community gives fuck all about.
Well, this is what I'm trying to work
into
on.
the steroids. So well, you're You're leading the pack, but we need more people on this subject, obviously. So like for some of the steroids, I don't think this will ever be investigated. So we might get non-genomic responses, just like we might get aromatase inhibition, right, from certain steroids, but it will never be studied. So we have to go with anecdotal reports. And this is why sometimes stacks might just be, based on the scientific evidence, don't make sense because the studies haven't been performed yet.
Correct.
We have this study. We can put it in the link below. I'll share my screen. This is a really nice picture, which is all the non-genomic responses. And this is from non-genomic responses in response to cardiovascular disease. And it was more so aimed around, apoptotic pathways that happen from non-genomic responses, whether it's through the G-protein coupled receptor, the cell surface androgen receptor that plays off into the calcium signaling. What we sort of talk about with either strength increases or neurodegeneration or dopamine stimulation through the L-type calcium channel, increase in CAM and calmodulin and calcium intake into the cell.
When I mentioned
as you can
nerves,
see, most of
when
the
I said nerves before, that's just
non-genomic-
talking about calcium.
No.
we say like the non-genomic pathway, as you can see, is quite a negative pathway where you're increasing, apoptosis on about 4 different levels. But then you do get some increase in nitric oxide, some increase in calcium signaling. Some of obviously the signaling down into the endoplasmic reticulum plays off into muscle protein synthesis as well. So, and obviously the ERK pathway. But like Kurt said, we're way behind that. That picture is all based off I guess, testosterone and animal studies as opposed to being, looking at anavar, oxandrolone, winstrol, etc. The paper, people can go read it. It's all based off what's sort of viewed in vitro and animal studies.
And I think one of the limiting factors why we can't do polypharmacy with this stuff is because the dosing becomes a problem, right? Because and what drugs are you combining? How would you study all this, the possible combinations, and then the genetic response, and then right, you get guys that use 300 milligrams total, and you get guys that use 10,000 milligrams total. The responses can be totally different.
Yeah.
So can't really be studied.